It was one of those perfect autumn mornings in England when the air feels crisp and clean, and the sky holds that special kind of brightness that makes everything look sharper, more alive. The leaves were turning golden and red, creating a beautiful backdrop against the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle. Inside the castle grounds, preparations had been underway since dawn for what was meant to be a routine ceremonial event. But nobody knew it would turn into something much more memorable. Princess Charlotte was 8 years old that day. She wore a navy blue coat with a velvet collar, her hair neatly brushed and held back with a small clip. Walking between her parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, she carried herself with the kind of natural confidence that comes from being raised in the public eye, but never quite getting used to it. Her parents had always taught her to smile, to wave, to be present in these moments, but they had also taught her something deeper, to really see people, to notice things that others might miss. The crowd outside the castle barriers was massive. Hundreds of people had gathered, maybe even thousands, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal family. They pressed against the metal barriers, phones held high above their heads, everyone trying to get that perfect photo or video to share with friends or post online. The noise was incredible. Cheering, calling out names, the clicking of camera shutters creating a constant background rhythm. Security personnel moved along the barriers, keeping a watchful eye on everything, their faces serious and alert. Charlotte had been to dozens of these events before. She knew the routine by heart: walk slowly, smile at the crowd, stop when her parents stopped, wave when it felt right. But something was different today. Maybe it was the way the sunlight hit the castle walls, or maybe it was just one of those moments when you're more awake to the world around you than usual. Whatever it was, Charlotte found her attention wandering away from the crowds and their cameras, away from the carefully choreographed movements of the royal procession. Her eyes landed on the guards standing at their posts near the castle entrance. These guards, in their distinctive red tunics and tall bearskin hats, were as much a part of Windsor Castle as the stones themselves. Tourists loved them, always wanting to take pictures with them, always amazed by how still they could stand. Charlotte had seen these guards her whole life. Her grandfather had served in the military. Her uncle had too. She understood, even at 8 years old, that these weren't just decorations or tourist attractions. They were real people doing a real job. One guard in particular caught her attention. He stood ramrod straight at his post, his rifle held at exactly the right angle, his face forward, expressionless. He looked young, probably in his early 20s. There was something about the set of his shoulders, the absolute stillness of his posture, that spoke of intense concentration and discipline. Charlotte found herself watching him as her family moved slowly through their scheduled route, pausing for photos, accepting flowers from children in the crowd. The atmosphere around the castle was festive, almost like a fair. People were laughing, chatting with each other, taking selfies with the castle in the background. Vendors nearby sold souvenirs, miniature guards, Union Jack flags, postcards. The smell of coffee and fresh pastries drifted from a nearby cart. It should have been a perfect, happy scene. And for most people there it was. But Charlotte noticed something else. She saw how some tourists were treating the young guard as if he were a statue, not a person. They were getting closer to him than they should, waving things in front of his face to try to make him react, laughing when he didn't blink or move. She watched as one person made funny faces at him, while another tried to touch his uniform. The guard didn't react, he couldn't, not without breaking protocol, but Charlotte saw something in his eyes, something that made her chest feel tight. Her mother touched her shoulder gently, encouraging her to keep moving. The schedule was precise, timed to the minute. They had other places to be, other people to greet. Charlotte walked on obediently, but she kept glancing back at the guard. She thought about how tired his legs must be from standing so still, how hot that heavy uniform must feel even on a cool autumn day, how hard it must be to ignore people who were treating you like an object rather than a human being. The royal family reached their designated spot for formal photographs. Photographers called out instructions, asking them to look this way, then that way. Charlotte stood where she was supposed to stand, smiled when she was supposed to smile, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about something her grandmother had once told her about respect, that it wasn't just about titles or positions, but about recognizing the dignity in every person. No matter who they were or what job they were doing, she could still see the guard from where she stood. More tourists had gathered around him now, emboldened by the festive atmosphere and perhaps by seeing others act the same way. They were taking turns posing next to him, making jokes, trying to get him to laugh or react. Some of them probably didn't mean any harm. They probably thought it was all in good fun, part of the tourist experience. But Charlotte could see what they couldn't or wouldn't see. The slight tension in the guard's jaw, the way his fingers gripped his rifle just a fraction tighter than before, the tiny, almost invisible signs that he was human and that this was affecting him. Something was building inside Charlotte, a feeling she couldn't quite name. It was part anger, part sadness, part determination. She was only 8, but she knew the difference between right and wrong. She knew what it felt like to be stared at by strangers, to have people treat you differently because of who you were rather than who you really were inside. She knew what it meant to have to maintain composure even when you wanted to run away or cry or shout. The photographers finished their work. Her parents began to move toward the castle entrance, ready for the next part of the ceremony. The crowd's attention started to shift, following the royal family's movement. But Charlotte's attention stayed fixed on that young guard, still standing at his post, still enduring what nobody should have to endure while simply trying to do their job with honor and dignity. In that moment, standing there in her navy blue coat with the autumn sun on her face, Princess Charlotte made a decision. It wasn't a decision born from being told what to do or from following a script. It was a decision that came from somewhere deep inside, from that place where we all know, without being taught, what kindness looks like and what courage requires. She didn't know yet exactly what she would do, but she knew she couldn't just walk away and pretend she hadn't seen what was happening. The crowds continued their noise and celebration, unaware that they were about to witness something far more meaningful than a routine royal appearance. They didn't know that a young princess, barely 8 years old, was about to teach them all a lesson about humanity, respect, and the real meaning of royal duty. The stage was set, though nobody knew it yet, for a moment that would ripple far beyond that autumn morning at Windsor Castle. The young guard's name was Thomas. He'd been serving in the household division for just over a year, and this was supposed to be one of the proudest moments of his career, standing post at Windsor Castle during a royal family appearance. He'd trained for months to earn this position, learning to stand perfectly still for hours, to ignore distractions, to represent the best of British military tradition. His family back home in Yorkshire was so proud of him. His grandmother had cried when she saw him in his full ceremonial uniform for the first time. Thomas had been at his post since early morning. His legs ached, his back was stiff, and the heavy bearskin hat made his head feel like it was carrying an extra 10 pounds. But he'd trained for this. He could handle physical discomfort. What he hadn't fully prepared for was the way some tourists would treat him, as if he were part of the castle architecture, rather than a living, breathing person. It had started innocently enough. A family with young children had approached, and the parents took photos while keeping a respectful distance. Thomas didn't mind that at all. He understood people's curiosity, their desire to capture a unique moment. That was part of his job in a way, representing something larger than himself, being part of living history. Those interactions felt fine, even meaningful, but then others started to gather and the tone began to shift. A group of teenagers approached, laughing loudly, clearly trying to outdo each other with their boldness. One of them waved his hand directly in front of Thomas's face, inches from his nose, trying to make him blink or flinch. When Thomas didn't react, maintaining his trained composure, the teenager laughed and did it again, slower this time, making exaggerated movements. "Look, he's like a robot," one of them shouted, and the others laughed harder. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the middle distance exactly as he'd been trained. "Don't react. Don't engage. Maintain the dignity of your position." His sergeant's words echoed in his mind. But inside, something was churning. He wanted to tell them that he was someone's son, someone's brother, that he had feelings and thoughts and dreams just like they did. He wanted to ask them if they'd like it if someone treated them this way while they were trying to do their job. More people joined in, emboldened by the teenager's behavior. An older man with a camera started making funny faces at Thomas, contorting his features in exaggerated expressions, trying to get a reaction for his video. A woman in a bright red jacket approached closer than protocol allowed, reaching out as if to touch the brass buttons on his tunic. Thomas's training held firm. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge any of it. But the effort of maintaining that stillness while being treated like an object was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. The worst part was the laughter. It wasn't mean-spirited laughter exactly. Most of these people probably thought they were just having fun, enjoying their day out, participating in what they saw as a quirky British tradition. But to Thomas, standing there unable to respond or defend himself, each laugh felt like a small cut. He thought about his military training, about all the times his instructors had talked about honor and duty and service. None of those lectures had prepared him for this particular challenge. Not enemy fire or difficult terrain, but simply being treated as less than human by the very people he was there to serve and protect. A young man in a football jersey approached next, holding his phone up for a selfie. He draped his arm around Thomas's shoulders as if they were old friends, making a peace sign with his fingers while his companion took the photo. Thomas could smell the beer on the man's breath, could feel the weight of his arm on his shoulder, but he remained motionless. The man's friend then wanted the same photo, and then another person, and suddenly there was a small queue forming, people waiting their turn to pose with the guard as if he were a wax figure at a museum. Through all of this, Thomas's training held. His face remained expressionless, his posture perfect, his rifle at exactly the correct angle. To any observer who didn't look closely, he appeared completely unbothered, perhaps even unaware of what was happening around him. But if someone had looked carefully, really carefully, they might have noticed the slight tightness around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped his rifle just a fraction more firmly than necessary. What made it harder was that Thomas could see other guards at their posts having similar experiences. This wasn't unique to him. It was happening all along the line, part of what they all endured as part of their duty. Some of the tourists were respectful, yes, but enough of them weren't. And there was nothing any of the guards could do about it except stand there and take it. They couldn't speak. They couldn't step back. They couldn't ask people to stop. All they could do was embody the discipline and professionalism they'd spent months developing, even when that discipline felt like it was being mocked. Thomas thought about his training sergeant, a tough man with 30 years of service, who had told them during their preparation, "You'll stand there and you'll represent something bigger than yourself. Some people won't understand that. They'll treat you like a curiosity or a joke, but you'll hold your ground because that's what we do. We maintain standards even when others don't." At the time, Thomas had nodded along with the others, thinking he understood, but standing here now, feeling his dignity being chipped away by people who saw him as entertainment rather than a person, he understood in a much deeper, more painful way. This was harder than any physical challenge he'd faced in training. This required a different kind of strength. The strength to maintain your humanity internally while being treated as inhuman externally. The crowd around him grew larger. More phones appeared, more laughter, more people testing the boundaries of what they could get away with. Someone made a loud noise right next to his ear, trying to startle him. Another person tossed a small pebble at his feet. A child, clearly encouraged by adults who should have known better, ran up and touched the hem of his tunic before running away giggling. Through it all, Thomas stood. He stood because that was his duty. He stood because he'd made a commitment. He stood because generations of soldiers before him had stood, and because he believed in something larger than his own comfort or dignity. But believing in something doesn't make it easy. And standing there, being treated like an object of amusement rather than a person deserving respect, was one of the hardest things Thomas had ever done. His throat felt tight. His eyes burned slightly, though whether from the effort of not blinking or from something else, he wasn't entirely sure. He focused on his breathing, on staying present, on getting through this moment and then the next moment and then the one after that. What Thomas didn't know, couldn't see from his fixed forward gaze, was that someone had noticed. Someone had seen past the crowds and the cameras and the casual cruelty of people who didn't realize what they were doing. Princess Charlotte, standing with her family for photographs, had watched the whole thing unfold. And unlike the adults around her who had grown used to seeing guards treated this way, she recognized it for what it was. Wrong, simply wrong, and something that needed to stop. Charlotte stood beside her parents, smiling for the cameras as she'd been taught. But her mind was miles away from the formal photographs being taken. She kept thinking about the guard, about what she was witnessing, and about whether anyone else saw what she was seeing. It puzzled her that the adults around her, her parents' staff, the security personnel, even her parents themselves, seemed to accept this as normal, as just part of how these events went. She'd been raised with very clear ideas about respect. Her parents had always emphasized treating everyone with kindness, regardless of their position or title. Her grandmother had often told her stories about the importance of duty and service, but also about compassion and understanding the human side of formal occasions. Charlotte had absorbed these lessons the way children do, not as abstract concepts, but as real guides for how to move through the world. Now, watching this young guard endure what he was enduring, Charlotte felt something click into place. This wasn't just a lesson in a storybook or a principle discussed over dinner. This was real, happening right in front of her, and it was wrong. The guard was doing his job, doing it perfectly from what she could tell, and people were treating him like he wasn't even a real person. How could that be okay? How could everyone just walk past and pretend not to notice? She thought about how she felt when people stared at her, when cameras followed her everywhere, when strangers felt entitled to comment on what she wore or how she looked. It made her feel small sometimes, like she wasn't really a person but just an image for others to judge and discuss. And she had her family around her, supporting her, reminding her of who she really was beyond the public role. But this guard, he was standing there alone, unable to speak or move or defend himself in any way, with nobody stepping in to help him. Charlotte's mother leaned down and whispered something about the next part of the schedule. They'd be moving inside the castle soon, meeting with some officials, following the carefully planned itinerary. Charlotte nodded automatically, but her heart wasn't in it. She kept glancing back at the guard, watching as more tourists approached him as the harassment continued. She saw a woman in a yellow sweater laughing as she made faces at him. She saw a man pretending to march alongside him in an exaggerated, mocking way. She saw it all, and something inside her refused to look away. There was a moment, Charlotte would remember it clearly later, when the guard's composure seemed to waver just slightly. It was barely visible, just a tiny flicker in his expression, a brief tightness around his eyes. Nobody else seemed to notice it, but Charlotte saw it. And in that moment, she understood something important. Beneath that perfect stillness, beneath that disciplined exterior, was a real person who was hurting. Not physically, perhaps, but in a way that mattered just as much. She'd learned about empathy in her lessons, but this was different from any textbook definition. This was feeling someone else's discomfort in her own chest, feeling the unfairness of the situation in her own heart. Charlotte was only 8, but she'd lived enough life, been in enough formal situations to understand what courage looked like. She'd seen her parents make difficult decisions, handle challenging moments with grace. She'd watched her grandparents navigate complicated situations with dignity. Now, standing there in the autumn sunshine, she realized that this was her own moment to choose what kind of person she wanted to be. The easy thing would be to do nothing. Nobody expected an 8-year-old princess to intervene in a situation like this. She could simply follow her parents inside, enjoy the rest of the event, go home and forget about what she'd seen. The guard would finish his shift eventually. Other guards would take his place. The tourists would move on to their next attraction. Everything would continue as it always had, with guards standing silently while some people treated them poorly and everyone else pretended not to notice. But Charlotte found she couldn't accept that. Something her father had told her once came back to her. Having a title means nothing if you don't use whatever influence you have to make things better. At the time, she'd been too young to fully grasp what he meant. Now in this moment she understood perfectly. She had something most people didn't have. People listened when she spoke, even at 8 years old. People paid attention to what she did. If she walked away and did nothing, she'd be wasting something precious, something that could actually make a difference. Her hands felt clammy. Her heart was beating faster. Charlotte realized she was nervous, actually nervous about what she was thinking of doing. Breaking protocol wasn't something taken lightly in her family. There were reasons for the careful choreography of royal events, reasons for the planned movements and scripted interactions. Security concerns, diplomatic considerations, the weight of tradition, all of these things mattered. She'd been taught to follow the rules, to understand that her actions reflected not just on herself, but on her entire family. But she'd also been taught that some things mattered more than rules. Kindness mattered more. Respect mattered more. Treating people with dignity mattered more. And if following the rules meant ignoring someone's suffering, Then maybe just this once the rules needed to be bent. Charlotte looked up at her mother, then at her father. They were engaged in conversation with an official, discussing something important. Her younger brother was occupied with examining a flag nearby. The photographers had stepped back, reviewing their images. For just a moment, Charlotte stood in a small bubble of relative anonymity, noticed but not closely watched, present but not the center of attention. She looked back at the guard one more time. He was still standing perfectly straight, still maintaining his discipline despite everything. But Charlotte could see the cost of that discipline now, could see the human effort required to remain so still while being treated so carelessly. She thought about going home tonight and trying to fall asleep knowing she'd done nothing. She imagined lying in bed thinking about that moment when she could have helped but chose not to. The image made her feel sick to her stomach. That's when Charlotte knew with absolute certainty what she had to do. It didn't matter that she was young. It didn't matter that it might break protocol. It didn't matter that she felt nervous and wasn't entirely sure how people would react. What mattered was that someone needed to stand up for that guard, needed to remind everyone that he was a person deserving respect, and she was someone who could do that, not because she was special or better than anyone else, but simply because she happened to be there in that moment, with the ability to speak and be heard. She took a deep breath, feeling the autumn air fill her lungs. Her legs felt a bit shaky, but she steadied herself. Charlotte had watched her parents and grandparents face difficult moments with courage. She'd seen what real bravery looked like, and it wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. This was her moment. This was her choice. And in the seconds before she acted, Charlotte felt something shift inside her. A growing up that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with deciding who you want to be in the world. The photographers had moved away. The official had finished speaking with her parents. The crowd's attention had drifted slightly, following some new movement at another part of the barrier. It was now or never, Charlotte realized. If she was going to do this, if she was going to step forward and use her voice, it had to be now. Charlotte didn't give herself time to second guess. She knew that if she thought too much about what she was going to do, she might talk herself out of it. So she simply moved, stepping away from her parents' side with a purposefulness that surprised even herself. Her feet carried her across the stone courtyard, each step deliberate and sure, even though her heart was hammering in her chest. Her protection officer, a tall man who'd been with her family for years, immediately noticed her movement. His training kicked in instantly. When a member of the royal family moves unexpectedly, you move with them. But something about Charlotte's posture, the determination in her small frame, made him pause for just a second. She wasn't running away or wandering aimlessly. She was walking toward something specific, and there was a quality to her movement that commanded respect, even from a trained security professional. The crowd began to notice. Whispers rippled through the people pressed against the barriers. Phones that had been lowered started rising again. Was the princess coming toward them? Was this part of the planned event? People jostled for better positions, hoping to catch whatever was about to happen. But Charlotte's focus wasn't on the general crowd. Her eyes were fixed on one destination, the young guard who was still enduring his tormentors. As she got closer, the tourists who'd been harassing Thomas suddenly realized who was approaching. The laughter died in their throats. The man who'd been making funny faces froze mid-expression. The teenagers who'd been waving their hands in front of Thomas's face stepped back instinctively. There was something about seeing this small girl in her navy coat walking toward them with such purpose that made them suddenly aware of their own behavior in a way they hadn't been moments before. Charlotte positioned herself directly between Thomas and the crowd. It was a bold move, one that put her in the space where all the harassment had been happening. She could have stopped at a safe distance, could have spoken from beside her parents, but instinctively, she understood that physical positioning mattered. By placing herself between the guard and his tormentors, she was making a statement with her body before she even opened her mouth. She was saying, "If you want to continue this, you'll have to do it with me standing here watching you." For a moment, everything was silent. The courtyard, which had been filled with noise and laughter just seconds before, went completely quiet. Even the photographers, trained to capture every moment, seemed to pause in surprise. This wasn't in the schedule. This wasn't planned. Something real and unscripted was happening, and everyone could feel it. Charlotte looked up at Thomas. From her position, he seemed impossibly tall, his bearskin hat adding even more height. But she could see his face now, could see the strain around his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. For just a second, their eyes met. Thomas, bound by his training, couldn't acknowledge her directly, but Charlotte saw something flash in his expression. Surprise, maybe gratitude, maybe disbelief that this was actually happening. Then she turned to face the crowd, all those people, adults mostly, with their cameras and their phones and their guilty expressions. Charlotte had spoken in public before, at school events and small family gatherings, but never like this. Never in a moment where she was choosing to break protocol, choosing to speak out about something that mattered. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, louder than you'd expect from someone so young. "Please stop," she said. The words carried across the courtyard, reaching even the people at the back of the crowd. "He's working very hard to protect us all." The simplicity of her statement was what made it so powerful. She didn't lecture or scold. She didn't use complicated language or appeal to rules and regulations. She simply stated a fact. This person is working, this person is protecting us. Please treat him with the respect that deserves. It was the kind of logic that even a child could understand, which perhaps made it all the more embarrassing for the adults who'd been behaving so poorly. The impact was immediate and visible. Faces in the crowd transformed. You could actually see the moment when people realized what they'd been doing, how it must have looked, how it must have felt for the guard. The woman in the yellow sweater put her hand over her mouth. The man with the camera lowered it slowly, his face flushing red. The teenagers who'd been so bold moments before suddenly couldn't meet anyone's eyes, staring down at their feet like children caught misbehaving. "I'm sorry," someone said quietly. Then another person echoed it. "So sorry." The apologies rippled through the crowd like a wave. Some people were crying, actually crying, moved by the combination of a child's courage and their own sudden awareness of what they'd been participating in. A few people started to clap, slowly at first, then others joined in. Applause building not in celebration but in recognition. Recognition of Charlotte's bravery. Recognition of their own need to do better. Charlotte stood there for a moment longer, making sure her message had truly been received. She wanted to say something to Thomas, to tell him that she saw him, that she understood. But she knew he couldn't respond. So instead, she simply stayed there for a few more seconds, her presence serving as a shield, as a statement, as a reminder to everyone watching that the guard was a person who deserved respect. Behind her, Charlotte could sense her parents and the rest of the royal party processing what had just happened. She knew there would be conversations later, possibly some difficult ones about protocol and safety and the proper way to handle situations. But she also knew with a certainty beyond her years that she'd done the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. And sometimes being part of a royal family means using your position not for privilege but for protection, protecting those who might not be able to protect themselves. The crowd had completely changed now. The festive carnival-like atmosphere from earlier was gone, replaced by something more somber and reflective. People were talking quietly among themselves, some looking ashamed, others looking thoughtful. The phones were still out, but now they were capturing something different. Not a spectacle or a joke, but a moment of genuine human connection and moral clarity. Charlotte turned back to look at Thomas one more time. He was still standing at perfect attention, still maintaining his post, but something had shifted. The tension around his eyes had eased slightly. His shoulders, while still straight and proper, seemed to carry less weight. And though he couldn't smile or speak or acknowledge what had just happened, Charlotte could sense his gratitude as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. Then, with the same quiet determination that had brought her there, Charlotte walked back to her parents. Her mother was waiting, and as Charlotte approached, she saw something in her mother's face that made her feel warm inside. Pride, unmistakable pride, mixed with a kind of wonder. Her mother placed a gentle hand on Charlotte's shoulder, a simple gesture that communicated volumes. No words were needed. They both understood what had just happened, and they both knew it mattered. The official schedule was in shambles now, the carefully timed progression of events thrown off by Charlotte's unplanned intervention. But nobody seemed to mind. The officials were whispering among themselves, the photographers were frantically reviewing their footage, and the crowd was still processing what they'd witnessed. In those few moments, Charlotte had transformed a routine royal appearance into something memorable, something meaningful, something that would resonate far beyond that autumn morning at Windsor Castle. As the royal family finally moved toward the castle entrance, continuing with their planned event, Charlotte glanced back one final time. Thomas was still at his post, still doing his duty with the same discipline and dedication. But now the space around him was respectful. People were keeping their distance, treating him with the dignity he deserved. And Charlotte knew that her small act of courage had made that difference. The silence that followed Charlotte's words hung in the air like something physical, something you could almost touch. For those few seconds, everyone in that courtyard seemed frozen in a moment of collective realization. The phones that had been held high to capture funny videos of the guard now hung lower, forgotten, as their owners grappled with what had just happened and what it revealed about their own behavior. A woman near the front of the barrier was the first to truly break. Her name was Helen, and she'd been visiting from Australia with her husband, excited to see the royal family and experience British traditions. She'd been one of the people laughing earlier, taking photos while her husband made exaggerated saluting gestures near the guard. But now, watching this small girl stand up for someone who couldn't defend himself, Helen felt something crack open inside her. Tears started rolling down her cheeks before she even fully understood why she was crying. "I didn't think," she said to her husband, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think about him as a real person. I just saw the uniform, the tradition, the photo opportunity. But he's somebody's son, isn't he? He's just doing his job and we were treating it like a joke." Her husband stood silent beside her, his earlier amusement completely gone. He'd been in the military himself years ago before emigrating to Australia. He should have known better. He did know better, but somehow caught up in the tourist atmosphere, in the mindset of being on vacation where normal rules don't quite apply, he'd forgotten basic decency. The shame felt heavy in his chest. Around them, similar conversations were happening. Parents who'd encouraged their children to pose near the guard to try to make him laugh were now explaining in hushed voices why that had been wrong. The children, with the clear moral vision that kids sometimes have, understood immediately. "But Mummy, you told me to," one little boy said, confused by the sudden change in his parents' attitude. The mother had no good answer for him, and that perhaps drove the lesson home even more powerfully than anything else could have. The teenagers who'd been the most persistent in their harassment were experiencing their own reckoning. At 16 and 17, they were old enough to know better, but young enough to still be learning about consequences and empathy. They'd been showing off for each other, each trying to be bolder than the last, caught up in group dynamics that made cruelty feel like fun. But watching someone younger than them demonstrate more maturity and courage than they'd shown made them face something uncomfortable about themselves. One of them, a tall boy with red hair, found himself thinking about his older brother who was in the army. He imagined his brother standing at a post somewhere, having to endure what this guard had endured, and suddenly felt sick. What if someone had treated his brother that way? What if someone had mocked him, tested him, treated him like he wasn't human? The thought made him want to apologize, but he didn't know how. Didn't know if it would be appropriate to approach the guard, or if that would just make things worse. Throughout the crowd, phones that had been recording for social media were being quietly deleted. People who'd been planning to share funny videos of the stoic guard were reconsidering. Some were going further, deleting photos they'd already posted, typing out apologies and captions, trying to undo the damage they'd contributed to. It was remarkable how quickly the mood had shifted from carnival to contemplation, how one child's simple statement had held up a mirror to hundreds of adults and shown them something they didn't particularly like about themselves. An older gentleman near the back of the crowd, a man named George who'd served in the Royal Navy decades ago, felt vindicated in a way he hadn't expected. He'd been uncomfortable all morning, watching how the guards were being treated, wanting to say something but not sure if it was his place. He was just a tourist now, just another visitor to the castle. Who was he to tell others how to behave? But this young princess had shown him that silence in the face of wrongdoing is its own kind of complicity. You don't need a special position to speak up for what's right. You just need to care enough to do it. The applause that had started slowly was building now, not the excited applause of entertainment, but something more solemn and meaningful. People were clapping not for a performance, but for a moment of moral clarity, for someone young enough to see clearly what adults had somehow lost sight of. Some were clapping for Charlotte, yes, but others were clapping for what she represented, the possibility of doing better, of being better, of remembering that traditions and tourist attractions and photo opportunities all involve real human beings deserving of respect. Thomas, still at his post, was experiencing his own flood of emotions. The relief was overwhelming. For the past hour he'd been fighting to maintain his composure, to live up to his training, to represent his regiment with honor despite the circumstances. He'd been succeeding, but the cost had been high. And then this child, this princess who could have simply ignored him like everyone else in a position of power seemed to be doing, had stepped forward. She'd seen him. Not just the uniform, not just the tradition, but him. Thomas, the person beneath it all. He couldn't show his emotions, couldn't let tears form or his expression change, but inside he was fighting the biggest battle of his day. The gratitude he felt was almost painful in its intensity. He thought about his grandmother again, about how she'd told him to always remember his worth, to never let anyone make him feel small. Today a child had reminded him of that worth, had reminded everyone watching of it. He would never forget this moment. Never. The protection officer who'd initially moved to follow Charlotte was now standing at a respectful distance, watching everything unfold with a mixture of professional concern and personal admiration. He'd been trained to prevent exactly this kind of unscripted interaction, to maintain security and protocol at all times. But he'd also been trained to assess situations, to understand context, to recognize when the rules might need to bend. This was one of those moments. No one was in danger. If anything, something important was happening, something that transcended security protocols and event schedules. Charlotte's parents had now fully processed what their daughter had done. Her father felt a surge of pride so strong it almost brought tears to his eyes. This was what they'd been trying to teach their children, not just how to follow protocol, not just how to wave and smile, but how to use whatever privilege and platform they had for good. Charlotte had understood that lesson in a way that went beyond words, in a way that could only be demonstrated through action. Her mother was thinking about her own childhood, about the lessons she'd learned about duty and service. She'd grown up knowing that being part of the royal family meant representing something larger than yourself, but also knowing that it meant never taking the easy way out when you could help someone. Charlotte had just lived that lesson in the most beautiful and unexpected way. The other guards at their posts along the courtyard had noticed what happened too. They couldn't turn their heads or abandon their positions. But news travels fast among people standing in a line, especially when something extraordinary occurs. Each of them felt a weight lift slightly. One child's courage had validated something they all understood but rarely saw acknowledged. That their service mattered. That they mattered. That maintaining dignity and discipline shouldn't require accepting disrespect. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, moving back from the barriers, giving the guards proper space, there was a new atmosphere around the castle. People walked differently, talked differently, looked at the guards differently. Some approached but stayed at a respectful distance, simply nodding acknowledgement or offering a quiet thank you. The guards couldn't respond, but they could feel the shift, could sense that something fundamental had changed in how they were being seen and treated. The moment was being captured by dozens of cameras and phones, footage that would soon spread far beyond Windsor Castle. But for right now, in this courtyard on this autumn morning, what mattered most was simpler than any viral video or news story. What mattered was that a young girl had seen someone being treated poorly and had decided to do something about it. What mattered was that hundreds of people had been reminded of a basic truth, that everyone deserves respect, that uniforms don't erase humanity, that standing up for others is not just the right thing to do, but the necessary thing. Within 30 minutes of Charlotte's intervention, the first video hit social media. A tourist from Canada had captured the entire scene on her phone. Charlotte walking toward the guard with determination, positioning herself protectively, speaking those simple but powerful words, and the crowd's subsequent transformation. She posted it with a caption that simply read, "Princess Charlotte teaching us all a lesson in human decency today." The video started spreading slowly at first, shared by a few friends and family members. But then someone with a larger following noticed it and shared it. Then a news aggregator picked it up. Then a major news outlet. Within 2 hours it was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. The speed at which it traveled was remarkable, but even more remarkable was the response it generated. Comments flooded in from around the world. "This made me cry," wrote someone from Japan. "That little girl has more courage than most adults," posted someone from Brazil. "I've been guilty of this exact behavior," admitted someone from Germany. "This changed how I'll act from now on." The honesty in people's responses was striking. This wasn't just people sharing a feel-good video. It was people genuinely reflecting on their own behavior, their own assumptions, their own capacity to treat others poorly without even realizing it. Back at Windsor Castle, palace officials were gathering for an emergency meeting. This kind of unscripted moment, especially involving a young member of the royal family, required careful management. The press secretary was fielding calls from media outlets around the world, all wanting official comment, all wanting more details. There were security concerns to discuss, protocol breaches to address, potential implications to consider. But as they watched the video themselves, as they saw the overwhelming positive response it was generating, they realized they were dealing with something unique. This wasn't a scandal to manage or damage to control. This was, if anything, one of the most positive representations of royal values that had occurred in years. The challenge wasn't how to handle criticism, but how to respond to overwhelming praise without appearing to take credit for something that had been entirely Charlotte's own moral action. The decision was made to release a simple, dignified statement acknowledging the event without over-explaining it. The Princess of Wales and Prince of Wales are proud of Princess Charlotte's compassion and courage in standing up for someone who couldn't defend himself. It reflects the values of respect and service that the family holds dear. Short, honest, and letting Charlotte's actions speak for itself. Thomas, the guard, had completed his shift and was in the barracks when his phone exploded with messages. Fellow soldiers, friends, family members, everyone had seen the video. His mother called crying, saying she'd never been more proud of him for maintaining his composure and never been more grateful to a child she'd never met. His grandmother sent a text in all capital letters. "That little princess is an angel. You stood tall and she stood up for you." His commanding officer called him in for a conversation. Thomas worried briefly that he might be in trouble somehow, that maybe he'd failed in some aspect of his duty. But when he entered the office, he found his officer smiling. "Son, you just demonstrated exactly what we try to teach every soldier, maintaining dignity under difficult circumstances. And that young princess demonstrated something we should all remember, that true nobility isn't about titles. It's about character." The regiment was receiving thousands of messages from around the world, messages of support and respect for the guards in their service. People were sharing stories of times they'd seen guards being harassed, expressing regret for not speaking up. Veterans were weighing in, talking about the reality of serving in ceremonial positions, the psychological challenge of being treated as less than human while trying to represent the best of military tradition. What surprised many people was learning that this wasn't an isolated incident. Guard organizations came forward with statistics showing how common this kind of harassment was, how guards regularly dealt with people trying to make them react, touching their uniforms, making inappropriate jokes. There were even reports of more serious incidents. People trying to trip guards during their march, throwing objects, even physical assault in rare cases. Mental health advocates seized on the moment to discuss a broader issue, how we often fail to see the humanity in people whose jobs require them to suppress their natural responses and emotions. It wasn't just about guards, they pointed out. It was about anyone in a service position, anyone whose role requires them to absorb other people's behavior without responding. Charlotte's action opened up conversations about respect, empathy, and the emotional labor involved in so many jobs. News outlets sent reporters to Windsor Castle to do follow-up stories. They interviewed tourists who'd been there that day, many of whom spoke emotionally about how the experience had changed their perspective. Helen, the Australian tourist who'd cried, agreed to an interview. "I feel like I'll be a better person because of what that little girl taught me today," she said. "She's 8 years old and she understood something I'd forgotten, that every person deserves respect, no matter what uniform they're wearing or what job they're doing." The teenagers who'd been harassing Thomas were identified through social media, not maliciously, but through their own posts. They'd recorded themselves earlier in the day before Charlotte's intervention, and those videos had been shared by others. The boys issued a public apology through their school, which went viral in its own right. "We're deeply ashamed of our behavior," they wrote. "Princess Charlotte showed more maturity at 8 than we did at 17. We've learned a lesson we'll never forget. And we've committed to doing community service with veterans organizations to try to make up for how we acted." The video was being analyzed by media experts, psychologists, and cultural commentators. What was it about this particular moment that had resonated so deeply with so many people? Some suggested it was the purity of a child's moral clarity, in a world that often seems morally complex. Others thought it was the clear power dynamic, a princess using her privilege not for herself but to protect someone else. Still others believed it was simply a reminder that courage can come from the most unexpected places, that age and size don't determine moral capacity. Within a week, Charlotte's name was trending worldwide. She'd become a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not, of compassionate leadership and moral courage. Think pieces appeared in major publications. What Princess Charlotte taught us about respect. The power of speaking up, a child's lesson for adults. How 8-year-old Charlotte changed the conversation about service and dignity. The impact extended beyond social media and news coverage. Tourist behavior at Windsor Castle and other royal sites changed noticeably. Guards reported a dramatic decrease in harassment, a significant increase in respectful interactions. People would approach and maintain proper distance, offering words of thanks rather than trying to provoke reactions. Some tourists even started a tradition of leaving thank you notes at the guard posts, expressing appreciation for their service. Schools around the world began using the video as a teaching tool. Educators showed it to students when discussing topics like empathy, courage, standing up for others, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Children wrote letters to Charlotte, telling her about times they'd spoken up for someone or promising to be braver when they saw something wrong. Thomas received permission from his superiors to release a statement through official military channels. He chose his words carefully, knowing that anything he said would be widely shared. "I want to thank Princess Charlotte for her kindness and courage," and he wrote. "Her actions reminded me why I serve and reminded everyone watching that soldiers are people too. It was the most touching moment of my career, and I'll carry the memory of her compassion for the rest of my life." The statement was viewed millions of times, with many people noting the grace and dignity in his words. Here was a trained soldier, someone who'd endured harassment and then been defended by a child, expressing gratitude without self-pity, acknowledging what had happened while maintaining his professional bearing. It was another reminder of the basic decency that Charlotte had stood up for, the humanity that exists in everyone, regardless of their role or position. As the days passed and the initial frenzy of attention began to settle, what remained was something more lasting than viral fame. Charlotte had sparked a genuine shift in how people thought about respect, service, and the everyday courage required to speak up when something isn't right. Her simple action had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted, touching lives and changing perspectives across the world. 3 weeks after the incident at Windsor Castle, a primary school teacher in New Zealand stood before her class of 9-year-olds, with the video queued up on the classroom screen. She'd been teaching about empathy and courage, abstract concepts that children sometimes struggled to grasp. But when she showed them Charlotte's intervention, the understanding was immediate and concrete. "She's younger than us," one student observed, "but she was braver than all those adults." The teacher nodded. "Why do you think that is?" The discussion that followed was remarkable. The children talked about how sometimes kids can see things more clearly than adults, how grown-ups sometimes forget basic kindness when they're caught up in having fun or following what everyone else is doing. They talked about times they'd seen someone being treated unfairly and hadn't spoken up because they were scared or unsure, and then they made a pact. If they saw something wrong, they'd try to be brave like Charlotte was. This conversation was happening in classrooms across the world. In Tokyo, in São Paulo, in Toronto, in London, teachers were using Charlotte's example to help children understand that doing the right thing doesn't require being the biggest or oldest or most powerful person in the room. It just requires caring enough to act. But the impact went far beyond elementary schools. At the Royal Military Academy, where future officers were being trained, instructors incorporated the incident into their leadership curriculum. Here was a perfect example, they told their cadets, of how true leadership isn't about commanding authority. It's about using whatever influence you have to protect and serve others. Charlotte had more rank and privilege than anyone else in that courtyard, and she'd used it not to demand special treatment for herself, but to demand fair treatment for someone else. One cadet, a young woman named Patricia, who'd sometimes struggled with whether she belonged in the military environment, found Charlotte's example particularly meaningful. "If an 8-year-old can stand up to a crowd of adults," she told her roommate, "then I can definitely handle the challenges of being one of the few women in my unit. It's about believing that your voice matters and using it when it needs to be used." The tourist industry began taking notice too. Major travel companies started including sections in their orientation materials about respecting guards and other service personnel. Some created short videos using Charlotte's example, though never her actual footage without permission, to illustrate the importance of cultural sensitivity and basic human decency when traveling. Tour guides at Windsor Castle and other royal sites now specifically addressed the issue during their presentations, explaining that guards are active-duty military personnel deserving of respect, not props for entertainment. The change in behavior was measurable. Guards at Windsor reported that incidents of harassment had dropped by nearly 70% in the month following Charlotte's intervention. Similar decreases were noted at Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, and other sites with ceremonial guards. When incidents did occur, other tourists were now likely to speak up, following Charlotte's example in defending the guards. Social media continued to amplify the story, but in evolving ways. People began sharing their own stories of times they'd spoken up for someone, or times they wished they had. The hashtag #MakeCharlotteProud started trending, with people posting about acts of kindness and courage, both large and small. A teenager defended a classmate being bullied. An office worker spoke up when a colleague was being treated unfairly. A subway passenger intervened when someone was being harassed. Each story referenced Charlotte's example as inspiration. Mental health organizations found an unexpected ally in Charlotte's story. They'd been working for years to help people understand the emotional toll of jobs that require suppressing natural responses. Not just military guards, but nurses, customer service workers, teachers, anyone who has to maintain composure while dealing with difficult situations. Charlotte's action gave them a powerful narrative tool to help people understand these challenges. One mental health advocate wrote an article that went viral. "An 8-year-old understood what many adults miss. Emotional labor is real labor." The piece discussed how Charlotte had recognized the psychological cost of what Thomas was experiencing, how she'd understood intuitively that someone maintaining external composure might still be hurting internally. It sparked important conversations about the hidden, emotional work that so many jobs require, and the importance of recognizing and respecting that work. Veterans organizations worldwide reached out to Charlotte's family, asking if there was a way to honor her. After careful consideration, a decision was made to establish the Princess Charlotte Compassion Award, given annually to young people who demonstrate exceptional courage in standing up for others. The first recipients included a 12-year-old who'd organized her school to support homeless veterans, a 14-year-old who'd created an anti-bullying program, and a 10-year-old who'd befriended an isolated classmate with disabilities. The award ceremony, held at Windsor Castle, brought together young people from around the Commonwealth. Charlotte attended, characteristically modest about her role in inspiring the award. When asked to speak, she kept it simple. "Everyone deserves to be treated with kindness. If you see someone who needs help, you don't have to be special or important to help them. You just have to care enough to try." The impact on royal protocol itself was subtle but significant. There were quiet discussions within palace circles about the balance between tradition and humanity, between maintaining formal distance and showing genuine connection with people. Charlotte's action had demonstrated that breaking protocol could sometimes serve a higher purpose, that rules exist to serve values, not the other way around. While no formal changes were announced, those close to the family noticed a slightly more relaxed approach to certain situations, a greater willingness to let authentic moments happen, even if they weren't in the schedule. Publishers began reaching out about books inspired by the incident. Several children's books were produced, with proceeds going to military charities. One particularly successful book, The Princess Who Spoke Up, told a fictionalized version of the story with Charlotte's permission and became a bestseller. Parents read it to their children at bedtime, using it as a starting point for conversations about courage, empathy, and doing the right thing even when it's uncomfortable. The incident even influenced academic research. Psychologists studying moral development in children cited Charlotte's action as an example of how young people can sometimes demonstrate more sophisticated ethical reasoning than adults. Her ability to see past the uniform to the person, her willingness to act despite potential consequences, her simple but powerful articulation of the problem, all of these became case studies in papers about moral courage and child development. 6 months after the incident, Thomas was invited to speak at a military conference about his experience. He'd been nervous about accepting. He was a soldier, not a public speaker, but his commanding officer encouraged him, pointing out that his perspective could help shape how the military thought about ceremonial duties and the well-being of personnel in public-facing roles. His speech was quiet and humble, but powerful. He talked about the reality of ceremonial guard duty, about the pride and the challenge of it. He spoke about the afternoon at Windsor Castle, about what it felt like to endure harassment while being unable to respond. And he talked about Charlotte, about how her intervention had validated not just him but every soldier who'd ever struggled with the same situation. She was 8 years old, he said, and she understood something that I hope we all remember. Our jobs, our roles, our responsibilities, none of these things erase our humanity. We are all people first, deserving of basic respect and dignity. Princess Charlotte reminded the world of that simple truth, and I believe her example will continue inspiring people to treat each other better for years to come. The speech received a standing ovation. Video of it was shared widely, completing a circle that had begun that autumn morning at Windsor. A guard had been defended by a princess, and now that guard was using his voice to continue the conversation she'd started, to keep alive the message about respect and humanity that she'd so simply and powerfully conveyed. The broader impact of Charlotte's action was becoming clear. She hadn't just helped one guard on one day. She'd sparked a movement toward greater empathy, toward recognizing the humanity in everyone regardless of their role or position. She'd reminded people that courage doesn't require being big or powerful, just caring and willing. She'd shown that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply to speak up and say, "This isn't right, and it needs to stop." And people around the world were listening, learning, and trying to live up to the example set by an 8-year-old girl who saw someone being treated poorly and decided to do something about it. 2 years had passed since that autumn morning at Windsor Castle, and the world hadn't forgotten. If anything, Charlotte's simple act of courage had become more significant with time, the way some moments do when their true meaning takes a while to fully emerge and be understood. On a crisp October afternoon, Charlotte stood in the same courtyard where it had all happened. She was 10 now, taller, her features beginning to show hints of the young woman she would become, but her eyes held the same clarity, the same ability to see what mattered that had defined her at 8. Today was special. A ceremony was being held to honor the guards of the Household Division, and Charlotte had been asked to present commendations to several soldiers for exceptional service. Among those soldiers was Thomas. He stood in formation with his fellow guards, his uniform impeccable, his bearing proud. In the 2 years since that day, his life had changed in ways he never could have anticipated. He'd been promoted. He'd become a trainer, teaching new guards not just the physical aspects of their duty but the psychological resilience required, the importance of remembering their own worth even when others might forget it. And he'd become an advocate, working with military organizations to improve support for personnel in ceremonial roles. The ceremony was formal, but there was an undercurrent of genuine emotion that formal occasions don't always have. When Charlotte approached Thomas to present his commendation, their eyes met, and for just a moment the formality fell away. Here was a young woman who'd defended him when he couldn't defend himself, and a soldier whose quiet dignity under difficult circumstances had inspired her to act. Two people whose lives had intersected for just a few minutes but who had changed each other in lasting ways. "Thank you for your service," Charlotte said, her voice steady and clear as she pinned the commendation to his uniform. The words were part of the ceremony's script, but they carried additional weight coming from her. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied, and though protocol required formality, his gratitude was evident in his tone, for reminding us all why service matters. The moment was captured by cameras. and the photograph would appear in newspapers the next day. Charlotte and Thomas, 2 years older, standing together in mutual respect. But the real story wasn't in that single photograph. It was in everything that had flowed from their first encounter. The Princess Charlotte Compassion Award had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. Hundreds of young people had been recognized for acts of courage and kindness. But more importantly, thousands more had been inspired to act, knowing that their actions mattered regardless of their age. Schools reported decreases in bullying, increases in students standing up for each other, more awareness of how we treat people in service positions. The award had become a catalyst for a broader cultural shift toward empathy and active compassion. Charlotte's parents watched the ceremony with quiet pride. They'd always hoped to raise their children to understand that privilege comes with responsibility, that royal titles mean nothing without the character to back them up. Charlotte had demonstrated that understanding in the most powerful way possible, not through words or intentions, but through action. She'd shown them that their teachings had taken root, that she understood what it meant to serve others even while being served yourself. The incident had influenced Charlotte's education, too. Her teachers noticed that she paid particular attention to lessons about social responsibility, about the difference between having power and using it well. She wrote essays about servants throughout history, about the people whose labor makes society function but whose contributions are often invisible. She asked thoughtful questions about class, privilege, and the structures that determine who gets respect and who has to fight for it. Her siblings had learned from her example too. Her older brother, future king, sometimes talked with her about what it meant to lead with compassion. Charlotte would remind him that the smallest gesture could matter enormously to someone who needs it, that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is simply to see people who others overlook. These weren't lectures, Charlotte was too humble for that, but conversations between siblings who were both trying to figure out how to live up to the expectations placed on them. The guards at Windsor and other royal sites still talked about Charlotte's intervention. It had become part of their collective story, a reminder of why they served and a validation that their service was seen and valued. New guards going through training were told the story, not as a novelty but as a meaningful example of the impact their role could have and the respect they deserved while performing it. Tourist behavior had permanently changed. The dramatic decrease in harassment that had followed the incident had been sustained. Guidebooks and tour companies now specifically addressed proper behavior around guards. But more than that, there seemed to be a broader shift in how people approached these interactions. Instead of seeing guards as curiosities or challenges, can you make them laugh? Can you make them move? People more often approached with respect and gratitude. Thank you for your service became a common phrase heard at guard posts, replacing the taunts and provocations that had once been all too common. The story had entered popular culture too. It was referenced in television shows and movies, always as shorthand for doing the right thing even when it's difficult. Remember, Princess Charlotte and the Guard became a phrase people used when encouraging someone to speak up, to intervene, to not just witness wrongdoing, but to actively oppose it. The story had become part of the collective consciousness, a shared reference point for conversations about courage and compassion. Charlotte herself remained remarkably grounded about it all. She'd done what she felt was right in a moment that demanded action, and she was genuinely surprised that others found it so remarkable. It was just the right thing to do, she'd say when asked about it, seeming genuinely puzzled that anyone would have done differently. That very humility, that inability to see her own action as exceptional, was perhaps what made her example so powerful. If she could do it, anyone could. If it was just the right thing rather than something heroic, then everyone had the capacity to act similarly. The ceremony concluded with Thomas and the other honored guards standing at attention while Charlotte and her family departed. As she walked past the formation, Charlotte glanced at Thomas one more time, and he offered the slightest nod, not enough to break his formal bearing, but enough to acknowledge the connection between them, the shared understanding that some moments change lives in ways both small and profound. Later that evening, Charlotte was at home with her family. They were having dinner, talking about the day's events, when her younger brother asked her a question. "Were you scared that day? When you walked over to help the guard?" Charlotte thought about it. "Yes," she admitted. "I was scared. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing or if I'd get in trouble. But I was more scared of not doing anything. I was scared of going home and trying to sleep knowing I'd seen something wrong and just ignored it. Her father smiled. That's what courage is, he said. Not the absence of fear, but doing what's right despite being afraid. I guess, Charlotte said, then grinned. But I still think people make too big a deal about it. It was just a few seconds. I just said what needed to be said. Her mother touched her hand gently. Sometimes that's all it takes, she said. A few seconds of courage, a few words spoken at the right moment. You'd be surprised how far those ripples can travel. As Charlotte got ready for bed that night, she thought about Thomas, about all the guards who served with such dedication, about all the people in the world doing difficult jobs with quiet dignity. She thought about the award recipients she'd met, young people finding their own courage to stand up for others. She thought about how one moment, one decision to speak up rather than stay silent, had somehow become part of something much larger than herself. The photograph from that day at Windsor, Charlotte at 8, standing between Thomas and the crowd, hung in her room now. Not because she wanted to celebrate herself, but because it reminded her of something important, that we all have moments when we can choose to act or stay silent, to speak up or look away, to use whatever influence we have for good or to waste it on indifference. Charlotte chose action. She chose compassion. She chose courage. And in doing so, she'd reminded the world that these choices are available to all of us every day, in small moments that can ripple outward in ways we can't predict, but that always matter. The legacy wasn't really about her at all. It was about the power we all have to make things better, one moment of courage at a time. And that legacy, Charlotte hoped, would outlast any headlines, any awards, any ceremonies. It would live in the countless small acts of kindness and courage that her example had inspired, and would continue inspiring for years to come.